everybody? Am I audible to everybody clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as you all know, around a month ago, we started these modules, the evening tutorials, primarily aimed at getting the neurology PGs prepared for theory exams. We are aware that you guys have 10-mark short notes, and these are the titles under which you have to write them. And this time we are moving on to our fourth module, which is the second module of dementia, in which we have selected the most frequent or most likely topics. Just before we begin with our lectures, just a small announcement of our second of its kind evening clinics. As you all know, we began our evening neurology clinics last Thursday, and the day after tomorrow will be our second of its kind. This time we have a muscle case, and expert will be none other than Dr. Khadilkar himself. So you're very fortunate to be able to see and listen to the comments from the big boss, Dr. Khadilkar, and that will be followed by MCQ and spots by Dr. Rakesh Singh. And with that, I think I will begin our today's session with the first lecture on neuroimaging in dementia by Dr. Nikhil Kadam, who is the young dynamic neurologist and lecturer at present working in Mumbai, and he is deep into academics at the moment because he's attached to the prestigious institute in Bombay. To you, Nikhil, for neuroimaging. You can share and begin, Nikhil.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Nikhil Kadam. I am assistant professor at Surgery Group of Hospitals at present. At the outset, I would like to thank Fine Committee.
Nikhil, come a bit close and be a bit more louder so that can be clearer.
Okay. At the outset, I would like to thank Fine Committee office bearers, Dr. Khadilkar sir, Dr. Rup Gurusani sir, Sudhir Kothari sir, for giving me this opportunity to conduct a live webinar. And special thanks to Pujari sir for facilitating this all and helping me to prepare this talk. So I will begin with my talk. This is a fine evening tutorial. My topic of presentation is role of neuroimaging in dementia. So my talk will be resident friendly, as this is this fine evening tutorial is for the residents to make them write short answer question if such kind of question appear in their examination. So I will say that your answer to this question should cover that is 10 marks, and starting with a traditional structural imaging, because your examiner will be a senior neurologist who will like that you start with a traditional neuroimaging first, because these are the traditional imaging modalities which are widely available. Even in the practice, you will come across with these imaging modalities only. So in traditional structure imaging, what are points you should cover is how these traditional imaging are useful in differentiating common dementia like Alzheimer's, frontotemporal, PDD, PSP, Huntington's, and its subtypes. And most importantly is to rule out the treatable causes. The traditional imaging should give you 3.5 marks if you describe it well. Next 1.5 marks will be awarded for newer methods and why it is required. If the student knows why the newer methods have been introduced apart from this traditional imaging, then 1.5 marks will be accorded. So in why newer methods, the student should cover the prodromal stages identification by functional imaging, the different pathologies in one phenotype like logopenic PPA can be FTD or AD pathologically, for which molecular imaging is derived. And the MCI cases, which eventually is going to progress to frank dementias, so that can be identified in these initial stages by these newer methods. Next 4 marks is describing all newer methods like functional MRIs, PET, SPECT, DAT, amyloid PET, tau PET, their protocols in brief and their application. And next, last 1 mark should be awarded for therapy implications of all these. So before starting the short question or any long question or short question in your examination, the rule of thumb is your answer should begin with a table or a flow chart or a diagram. This is why this is a rule of thumb, because this will give clear impression to your examiner that you know this topic very well and you have covered in your theory about this table or flow chart and diagram. And for students, also helpful for filling to
Dr. Kadam,
so first I will
Nikhil,
sir.
Dr. Nikhil Kadam.
Sir.
I think maybe if you could stop your video, because I think sometimes the hair is getting interrupted. Mansi, will that help?
Oh, yes, that will help, sir.
Okay.
Shall I start, sir?
Yes, you can. Carry on.
Yes. So resuming our tables, the first table in your answer should cover all the different types of dementia, their clinical presentations, their appearance on at the MRI, their appearance on PET or SPECT or DAT, and the newer imaging models like amyloid and tau PET. So starting with Alzheimer's disease, the clinical findings you all know: transient, the recent memory loss, language or visuospatial function impairment in atypical ADs. The atrophy predominantly in the medial temporal lobe, precuneus, lateral temporoparietal association cortices, and even PET or PET will also show similar hypomotorism in these areas. Amyloid and tau, as you know, Alzheimer's have both these pathologies. First initial phase amyloid and then later neurofibrillary tangles take over. So both these newer modalities will show amyloid deposition as well as tau deposition. So coming down in the table, AD and DLB, you can see they both have similar presentation on MRI. That similar areas are atrophied. So that's why PET has been more in differentiating between two. As clinical findings are totally different between AD and DLB. But in MRI point of view, if you want to differentiate between these two, PET has to be more useful, showing more of a posterior parieto occipital association cortex hypometabolism and putamen hypometabolism, classically called as cingulate island sign, in which posterior cingulate is spared or it has less of the hypometabolism as compared to precuneus and cuneus. So coming to the progressive aphasia variants, there are 3 variants described, out of which one logopenic, that is PPA-L, is fall under Alzheimer's umbrella or AD umbrella. It has impaired repetition. The language pathology is more predominant in these all progressive aphasia. So repetition is impaired of sentences and phrases, and phonological errors in the speech in logopenic variant. And atrophy will be seen on MRI in left posterior paleocerebral cortex. Similar hypometabolism on PET in these areas, and PPA-L will have amyloid deposition more likely, as it is more of a AD pathology, as well as tau deposition, because AD in the late stage have a neurofibrillary tangles. The non-fluent variant, third in a row, and a semantic variant, they fall under frontotemporal dementia umbrella, FTD umbrella, because there are more pathologically towards taupathies or TDP pathologies. So PPA non-fluent will be all agrammatic speech broadcast type. So anterior pericerebellum or left posterior frontoinsular cortex will show atrophy. Hypometabolism in the similar area in PET. Here amyloid PET will not show deposition because it's a FTD umbrella pathology. Even tau deposition is not there because TDP is a predominant pathological causative agent responsible for non-fluent anemia. Even semantic have similar anomic aphasia. Nouns will be very difficult for him. Single word comprehension will be lost. Surface dyslexia will be there. Left or right anterior temporal lobe. So there is a little bit confusion why right is there. Because if in semantic we have already been taught that left should be more involved. But sometimes semantic PPS can have prosopagnosia as their predominant presentation, and in that case, right anterior temporal lobe will be atrophied. Hypometabolism will be seen in the similar area. Tau deposition negative, or most of the time it's negative. In behavioral variant FTD, classical presentation is behavioral and personality changes and executive dysfunction. The classical knife edge atrophy with symmetric to moderately right predominant frontal or anterior temporal lesion atrophy in MRI, and anterior frontal and temporal association cortices will show hypometabolism. Corticobasal variant will have apraxia rigidity, superior parietal lobe will be atrophy, similar area will have hypometabolism, and it's a tau spectrum disorder, so tau PET will show deposition. PSP again, supranuclear pulses, Parkinsonism, executive function loss, midbrain will be atrophied. There are numerous MRI signs are there in PSP, which we'll discuss further in the course. Frontal association cortices will have hypometabolism and sometimes pimple signs indicating hypometabolism in the midbrain area, showing pimple-like appearance is a classical hallmark of PET in PSP. DLB I already discussed. It has to be differentiated with AD, and PET is very useful, FDG PET, and DAT scan is also very, very useful. The traditional MRI may not cause a differentiation. Coming to after taking table, you can come to diagram. You can draw few areas which will be atrophied. As it's a theoretical presentation or you are writing a theory paper, you can arbitrarily draw a well-structured brain, and you can show in AD these areas are atrophied, in FTD these areas are atrophied. Like in lateral view, if you draw lateral view, the perisylvian cortices can be highlighted, anterior or posterior. In sagittal view, precuneus or posterior cingulate gyrus atrophy can be highlighted, or you can draw circles around them showing atrophy. So this will give pictorial impression to examiner, and he will be very happy that you know all these areas very well. Even in superior view, the superior parietal lobule or parieto-occipital atrophy can be drawn, and you can show that posterior cortical variant of AD will have pathology here. In inferior view, frontotemporal atrophy, knife edge atrophy can be seen, and you can draw a circle around that. So these diagrams can be made in your examination, which will give you more marks. So starting with the structural imaging, little bit of description. CT versus MRI, you can give a short table for it. As CT is cost effective, MRI is more costlier. CT will take 5 minutes, 2 to 5 minutes at max, and so it is very useful in agitated, claustrophobic or your demented patients. MRI will take long and needs anesthesia. Hazards of radiation are there in CT. MRI will be safer as compared to that. Atrophy will be difficult to visualize, especially posterior fossa, but MRI will give classical excellent atrophy presentation in their different sequences. So that's why CT is not first-line investigation in dementia evaluation, but can be used as a screening to rule out other treatable causes like NPH, stroke, and associated vascular cognitive impairments, demyelination, chronic infections, SDH, and tumors. Structural imaging has usefulness mainly in AD dementia to look for atrophy of a specific areas. There are two ways of interpretation for AD dementia. First is a clinical reads and then a volumetric analysis. In clinical reads, various visual rating scale has been described, but Shelton scale is widely used. It uses coronal MRI images at the level of the pons, and scoring was done according to these differentiation, like no atrophy 0, widening of choroidal fissure 1, widening of inferior horn of lateral ventricles 2, loss of hippocampal height 3, and severe atrophy 4. Volumetric analysis is on the 3-dimensional T1 weighted sequences. The obtained volumes are compared.
Dr. Kadam,
Sir.
थोड़ा loud, be very loud actually. I think.
Okay, sir.
Speaker doesn't pick up well.
Sorry. Volumetric analysis is on a T1 weighted sequences. These obtained volumes are then compared against the standard brain atlas of healthy subjects, and the atrophy can be derived. Then coming to, you have to describe what are the imaging features of a treatable disorders. So first of its kind is vascular cognitive impairment. It can have varied presentations, starting from multi-infarct dementia, giving due to multiple bihemispheric strokes. Strategic location infarcts can give dementia-like presentations, mainly in the left hemisphere, perisylvian cortex, language areas, thalamus, midbrain, medial temporal lobe, medial frontal lobes. These location infarcts can give you dementia as a presentation. Small infarcts or microinfarcts causing subcortical dementia will give changes on white matter changes on MRI. Several arteriolar disorders like CADASIL and cerebral amyloid angiopathy will have characteristic MRI presentations. Some of the pearls in vascular cognitive impairment that ischemic lesions, they do not spare the primary cortices like paracentral or auditory cortices, whereas neurodegenerative disorders manifesting as dementia typically spare these primary cortices. And white matter damage, which we see in subcortical dementia, these lesions, if they are visible on T1 weighted images, then this white matter damage should be taken more significant. Next suitable disorder is NPH. There are various imaging signs described. First is the Evans index. It's a ventricular enlargement disproportionate to the cerebral atrophy. More than 0.3 Evans index will be in the favor of NPH. Callosal angle of 40 degree or greater will be in the favor of NPH. Narrowing of the sulci or dash pattern or enlarged subarachnoid spaces in the high convexity will be in favor of NPH. Ballooning of frontal horns, periventricular hyperintensities, thinning and elevation of corpus callosum, widening of temporal horns without hippocampal atrophy, and other diseases, other treatable disorders like demyelination, chronic infection, SJF tumors, they will have their own characteristic MRI changes. Coming to imaging features of Parkinsonian disorders, like in PSP, morning glory sign, for which axial images are preferred. The horizontal line is drawn along the posterior cerebral aqueduct, and second line along the lateral margin of the tegmentum. In normal subjects, this lateral margin of the tegmentum is convex and runs outside the second line. The morning glory sign is positive. That is, patient design PSP is said when the tegmentum is concave and the lateral margin runs inside the second line. The hummingbird sign again for PSP in sagittal image. Midbrain to pons ratio in midline sagittal image normal is 0.24, significantly reduced in PSP up to 0.12. Then in MSA, atrophy of the putamen, middle cerebral peduncle, pons or cerebellum will be seen. In hot cross bun, in T2 axial cross-shaped hyperintensity in the pons will be more in the favor of MSA C. And putaminal rim sign, that is hypointense putamen with hyperintense rim on T2 axials, will be more in favor of MSA P. Parkinsonism index, that is MRPI index, is mainly used to differentiate PSP from MSA or PD dementias. The equation is P divided by M into MCP divided by SCP, where P by M is a ratio of pons area to midbrain area on mid-sagittal images, whereas MCP by SCP is the width of the MCP and SCP on MCP on a parasagittal image and SCP on a coronal image. Abnormal will be more than 13.55. The sensitivity and specificity are greater than 90% in differentiating between PSP and PD and SA. So you can see this is a classical morning glory sign of PSP. The tegmentum, lateral margin of the tegmentum is inside the second line. First line is horizontal across posterior cerebral aqueduct. This is a classical hummingbird sign, atrophy of the midbrain. Hot cross bun in MSA, T2 axials. Putaminal rim sign, hypointense putamen with hyperintense rim on T2 axial. So these are traditional images. Now we should now discuss something about newer techniques, why it has been derived. Up to these, the traditional imaging are more useful, as you know, for more of treatable disorders. For AD and for FTD, the newer techniques have been introduced to see the hypometabolism So to differentiate between Alzheimer's and FTD, FDG PET and SPECT have been derived, which show hypometabolism in the specific areas which we have already seen in first table. Second importance or application is to define presence of early Alzheimer changes in patients with MCI, for which amyloid PET, tau PET, or functional MRI are useful. To differentiate DLBD and AD, FDG PET is useful, which see occipital hypometabolism, distinguish DLB from AD with a sensitivity of 90 and specificity of 87. And that scan is also very useful with significantly decreased nigrostriatal update compared to AD, particularly in the putamen. So to discuss protocols in brief, the SPECT and PET are actually a paradigm, they have a paradigm shift in conventional neuroimaging because it provides insight into the neurochemical functioning of the tissues. It mainly images proteins and neurotransmitters, and the principle remains more or same for all these three modalities. In that SPECT, we use a lipophilic tracer ligands like 99M technetium HMPAO, which moves into the brain tissue by diffusion. It emits gamma rays, which was detected by a gamma camera outside. So as it is a lipophilic tracer, it will mainly demonstrate degree of cerebral blood perfusion. In PET, what we'll use is, in FDG PET, which is most commonly used, we'll use glucose analog. So the radio tracer will be trapped in the cell irreversibly, and we will image it after 30 to 60 minutes. The ligands most commonly used is 18-fluoros FDG ligand. It will demonstrate mainly degree of cerebral glucose metabolism. Between PET and SPECT, if we differentiate, SPECT has a low sensitivity, less spatial resolution due to partial volume effect. PET do not have these kind of limitations. It has high specificity and sensitivity, better spatial resolution. We can quantify changes in PET, but cost is a limiting factor for PET. That scanning is actually on the principle of PET and SPECT. Only thing we use a tropan-based ligand like Prodat or 123-IBC DOPA-scan. It will mainly bind to DOPA transporters, so it will help in imaging dopaminergic system. It has inter-rater variability and is not readily available. Coming to molecular imaging, amyloid PET, it has been described that deposition of A beta plaque is the first step in the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's dementia. So, what do we do in amyloid PET? There's amyloid which is there in the cerebral tissue. It was bound by a Pittsburgh B compound and was imaged using PET. So, Pittsburgh B compound is actually a clinical trial compound. It has not been widely used in a private practice or a private setup. So, the Pittsburgh B compound that we have is 20 minutes only. So, the cyclotrons has to be available in the same clinical trial room. That's why some other newer ligands has been described like F18 fluorobutapir or F18 fluorobutaben, which has a longer T-half. Some clinical studies has given indications for amyloid PET, which we can see as first indication may be a persistent or progressive unexplained MCI patients with possible AD but unclear presentations, patient with progressive dementias and atypically early age of onset. We can use amyloid PET, but currently this modality is in clinical trial. Even tau PET is also in a clinical trial and has less offered application as compared to amyloid PET. Tau PET is especially useful in Alzheimer's dementia when the neurofibrillary tangles in advanced AD they correlate more strongly with the cognitive performance rather than amyloid. And in tau PET, what happens? Tau accumulation and the brain metabolism, they have inverse correlation, which is very tight as compared to amyloid accumulation. So regions with high in tau will uniformly show depressed metabolism. The radioligands for tau are first generation and second generation. There are different radioligands described. Functional MRI technique is you get a functional information by visualizing direct cortical activity. It is the principle on which it works is a blood oxygen level dependent. Like if we do any task, the blood around the area of the brain which has been activated will be deoxyhemoglobinized, and that deoxyhemoglobin will be having magnetic properties and it will be imaged. So the methods are task based like motor activation, visual or language to activate different areas. or resting state method also being useful, which measures spontaneous brain activity in multiple networks. So in Alzheimer's, we mainly focus on default mode networks, which involves medial frontal, medial temporal, posterior cingulate gyrus region, and decreased connectivity in this region is earliest. That is, this is the earliest sign in Alzheimer's disease, even before amyloid deposition. So fMRI has a wide application or a wide usefulness in very early stages of amyloid Alzheimer's disease. Even frontotemporal dementia, we get decreased signals in salience network. This network is the connection of anterior cingulate, orbitofrontal, and insular region. Coming to last part of my presentation is therapeutic benefit of all this. The newer methods, why they are therapeutically useful. That these new insight into these newer modalities have given insight into the pathogenesis and biomarkers, and lead to promulgation of a new set of research guidelines for the diagnosis of preclinical stages of AD. And experimental therapies also can be judged or can be designed to remove the amyloid, and whether they are really useful or not also can be judged with this newer modality. And in that scan, as a newer modality will give you differentiation between DLB and AD, which will be more useful when you are managing the psychotic symptoms in DLB, because these DLB patients are extremely sensitive to antipsychotic, not as compared to AD patients. So in managing these symptoms, the DAT scan will be very useful. My references to my presentation are: first is Mahalingam S. This will be useful for residents to know about PET, SPECT, DAT, amyloid tau imaging in detail. Second, neurology clinics, which the table which is from, the disease-wide changes has been enumerated very well in these neurology clinics. Third one is a update for general clinician. It's an excellent review for easy understanding. Last one is the neuroimaging in dementia, and Bradley, of course, the neuroradiology section of Bradley, and handouts of Dr. Kaumil Kothare. I am very thankful to him because he has made a very good handouts of newer imaging modalities, and he now usually presented in fine programs. So this is our usual picture in exams. We are laughing at our own answers, but it should be changed to this. You are writing papers and papers with the fine program. And best of luck to you all.
Thank you, Dr. Kadam. I think very thorough presentation. As you can see, although this appears to be the applied neuroscience, that is neuroradiology question, there is a lot of recent advances, and Dr. Kadam in his initial slides very nicely showed you how you would earmark, how many marks would be distributed for several points that you would be covering in each question. So from there, now we are going to move on to Alzheimer's again, and the next lecture is preventive measures for Alzheimer's. It is a relatively recent concept and could come into the clinical neurology, but also as portions of recent advances, and it will be delivered by our young neurologist from Nasik, Dr. Amit Yevle. To Amit Yevle, please. Amit, you can begin. You will have to unmute yourself. Yourself.
Can I start?
Yes. Begin.
Good evening to all. Today my topic is preventive measures of Alzheimer's dementia. After seeing neuroimaging, we'll go to preventive measures of Alzheimer's dementia. Scope of the lecture would include pathology, that is amyloid cascade hypothesis, pharmacological approaches to prevention, lifestyle modification interventions, ongoing prevention strategies, basic principles of dementia prevention program, future treatment directions, and few recent updates. And finally, there would be conclusion slide. As we know, Alzheimer's dementia, the most common cause of neurodegenerative dementia worldwide. Autosomal dominant Alzheimer's dementia has been linked to 3 genetic mutations, that is amyloid precursor protein gene, presenilin 1 gene, and presenilin 2 gene. If it is young onset Alzheimer's dementia, then it is always presenilin 1 gene mutation. The core pathological features are brain atrophy with regional neuronal and synaptic loss, presence of amyloid and neuritic plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, granulovacular degeneration, which are basically intracytoplasmic vesicles, and presence of hyarinobodies, which are eosinophilic rod-like structures. We'll go to amyloid cascade hypothesis. There are two forms, dominantly inherited forms of Alzheimer's dementia and non-dominant or sporadic Alzheimer's dementia. In dominantly inherited form, there is missense mutation in the APP or presenilin 1 or 2 gene, which in turn leads to increased A beta 42 production throughout the life. And non-dominant form of Alzheimer's dementia, that is sporadic form, there is failure of A beta clearance mechanism. For example, inheritance of ApoE4 and faulty A beta degradation, which in turn leads to gradually rising A beta levels with the aging process. Whether it is a dominantly inherited or non-dominant form, afterwards, the cascade remains same and it leads to the process of dementia. There is accumulation and oligomerization of A beta 42 in limbic and association cortices. Then there are subtle effects of A beta 42 oligomers on synaptic efficacy, gradual deposition of A beta 42 oligomers as a diffuse plaques. Then there is also microglial and astrocytic activation and inflammatory responses, which in turn leads to alteration of neuronal ionic homeostasis and oxidative stress injury. There is also alteration of kinase and phosphatase activities, which leads to neurofibrillary tangle formation. And afterwards, widespread neuronal and synaptic dysfunction and selective neuronal loss with attendant neurotransmitter deficits, which in turn leads to the process of dementia. After seeing this amyloid cascade hypothesis, we have to see now risk and protective factors. The risk factors, they are non-modifiable and modifiable. The modifiable risk factors, they are, we know, diabetes mellitus, insulin resistance, obesity, hypertension, dyslipidemia, vascular risk factors in which ischemic strokes, then obstructive sleep apnea, depression, psychological and physiological stress, traumatic brain injury, smoking addiction, alcohol abuse. The non-modifiable risk factors are aging process, sex, family history, and presence of apolipoprotein E epsilon 4 allele mutation. What are the modifiable protective factors after seeing these risk factors, which includes cognitive reserve and mental activity, educational attainment and lifelong learning, cognitive leisure activities, physical activity and exercises, mindfulness and wellness activities, diet or nutrition, which plays an important role. Few lines about diet. Diet plays an important role, and a new study at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, they developed a diet plan called Mind Diet, which may reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by as much as 53%. The study was published in Journal of Alzheimer's and Dementia. They looked at more than 900 people between the age group of 50 to 98 who filled out food questionnaires and underwent repeated neurological testing. The Mind Diet, it means Mediterranean intervention for neurodegenerative delay. There is also another diet, that is DASH, which is important for vascular risk factors, which means daily approaches to stop hypertension. There is a one thing to raise a toast to the Mind Diet, which recommends a glass of wine every day. The others are fish, poultry, olive oil, leafy vegetables, nuts, berries, beans, and whole grains. Therefore, what should be our vitamin plan or memory specific nutrients? They are phosphatidylserine, phosphatidylcholine, ginkgo biloba, omega-3 fatty acids, and etc. Yoga also plays an important role. A study which was published in 2016 at UCLA, which included 25 participants over the age of 55 who had memory loss. Prior to the start of cognitive training or the yoga and exercises, the participants were tested to evaluate the several aspects of their cognition, including visuospatial memory, verbal memory, and long-term memory. And the results showed that visuospatial memory scores of yoga group, they had a greater improvement than those in cognitive training group. And recently we celebrated International Yoga Day also on 21st June. What are the brain games to improve your memory and prevent Alzheimer's dementia? We know that crossword puzzles, game of shopping, jigsaw puzzles, suitcase game, concentration games, tray games, Sudoku, chess, brain yoga, rebus puzzle, and cube solving. These are the important brain games due to which we can improve our memory and prevent Alzheimer's dementia. What is the fear and what are the projections by Alzheimer's Association by 2050? If nothing is done, there would be 16 million people with Alzheimer's dementia in the United States and more than 60 million worldwide. Since 2003, every symptom and disease modifying agent has failed in phase 2 or 3 trials because of challenges of safety and efficacy. To develop a proper disease modifying therapy for individuals with symptomatic Alzheimer's dementia, there should be a concrete effort to initiate preventive measures in asymptomatic individuals. Therefore, biomarker development, advances in diagnostic criteria, and greater understanding of the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's dementia, it will make these initiatives more feasible. These efforts, they have a greater potential for pharmacological and non-pharmacological approaches, identification of at-risk individuals, expanding opportunities for earlier diagnosis, higher enrollment into randomized control trials by reducing screen failure rates, and eventually more effective treatment strategies. What are the pharmacological approaches to prevention? There are many preventive ongoing trials in Alzheimer's dementia going on, out of which they are anti-amyloid treatment in asymptomatic Alzheimer's study, which is also called as 4A study, in which the individuals recruited were in between 65 to 86 years of age with normal cognitive function and positive Alzheimer's dementia biomarkers. It was followed by 3 years of treatment with anti-amyloid monoclonal antibody, that is solanezumab. Another study, Tomorrow study, in which individuals recruited were in between the age group of 65 to 83 with normal cognition. There was polymorphism of TOM40 gene, which was associated with the greater risk of Alzheimer's dementia, followed for 5 years of treatment with pioglitazone and rosiglitazone, which are oral hypoglycemic agents. Then third study, DIAN study, that is dominantly inherited Alzheimer's network treatment study, in which solanezumab and gantenerumab were evaluated versus placebo in unaffected carriers. And the fourth one is APOE4 study, which investigated cognitively normal APOE carriers using active amyloid vaccine, that is passive immunotherapy. What are lifestyle modification interventions for which Libra study was done? Libra means Lifestyle for Brain Health study, which was a 16-year observational study of 949 individuals using lifestyle for brain health, which measures modifiable risk factors that we have already discussed now. Then 1 point increase in Libra score was associated with 19% greater risk of dementia. What are ongoing prevention strategies? The trials done, they are EPAD study, MINT trial, and FINGER study. EPAD study is a European prevention of Alzheimer's dementia, in which individuals were recruited to examine whether the alteration of risk factors for Alzheimer's dementia that occur early and midlife potentiates pathophysiological changes decades before the onset of dementia. Therefore, it was a European prevention trial. Then MIND trial was midlife innovative intervention for dementia deterrence, in which 11 identifiable risk factors were evaluated in 600 individuals to participate in online education intervention. And the third study, which was the finger study, that is Finnish geriatric intervention study, which was the largest, biggest RCT for Alzheimer's prevention till now, in which 1246 individuals were recruited. 2 years multi-domain intervention of diet, exercise, cognitive training, and vascular risk monitoring was done versus control to prevent cognitive decline, which was published in Lancet Neurology in 2015. The end result was improvement in the primary and main secondary cognitive outcomes was 25 to 150% better in the intervention group than in the control group. Ideally, what are the basic principles of a dementia prevention program? These 10 principles are very important. The first one is establishment of a longitudinal cohort of individuals without memory impairment and with prodromal disease. There should be development of a protocol which measures person-centered and health economic outcomes. There should be evaluation of clinical, cognitive, functional, and behavioral features annually. There should be collection of biomarkers, which included blood, spinal fluid, DNAs, cell lines, MRI, and PET scans. There should be encouragement of autopsy participation. Deep phenotyping of individuals should be performed with near total participation in all biomarker collection protocols. There should be application of precision medicine type interventions to match treatment to individual characteristics. Then test customize n of 1 interventions over a designated period to determine whether protocols altered biophysiological profiles, disease relevant biomarkers, and outcome measures. There should be developed a statistical plan to incorporate immediate, intermediate, and long-term time to event analysis, and creation of a trial ready cohort for large-scale pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. After this basic principle, what should be the model of a dementia prevention initiative? The figure A, it is a hypothetical model of a dementia prevention in which if there are more factors, each factor should be identified. And the figure B, it is a N of 1 trial model, means personalized protection plan in which the root cause of impairment, it is noted and the approaches are given accordingly. After these preventive measures, what is the conventional treatment of Alzheimer's disease? What we are giving clinical practice till now in last few years, that is acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, which includes donepezil, rivastigmine, and galantamine. Donepezil, the for 28 days followed by 10 milligram per day. The side effects we know: liver toxicity, vivid dreams, diarrhea, and cardiac conduction defects. Rivastigmine 4 milligram BID, maximum 12 milligram BID. The side effects, they are GI side effects, but using transdermal patch, the side effects, they are less. Then galantamine, which is available but not used in clinical practice due to severe cardiac side effects. The second group is NMDA receptor antagonist, which is memantine. The dose is 5 milligram per day up to maximum 10 milligram BID. The side effects are confusion and diarrhea. After this conventional treatment, what are the future directions? Which included vitamin E, that is alpha tocopherol. There is a concrete connection between vitamin E and Alzheimer's dementia process is the significant decrease of vitamin E in the CSF and plasma of Alzheimer's disease patients. And there have been several clinical trials that have shown increased all-cause mortality of high-dose vitamin E treatment. The negative trials included estrogen, then passive immunization against A beta, passive immunization against A beta, against tau, then tarenfluvril or flurizan, which is a gamma secretase inhibitor, cucurmine, which is having antioxidant and anti-aggregation properties, then idalopyridine, which is a 5-HT6 receptor antagonist, riluzole, nabilon, which is a cannabinoid receptor agent, then HMJ-CoA reductase inhibitors, that is statins. These are the things which are included in negative trials. We should also know about the disease modifying treatments, that is affecting modulation of amyloid deposition. There are 3 groups: drugs interfering with A beta aggregation, that is anti-amyloid aggregation agents, which included tramiprosed, which was in phase 3 trial, but they had negative results. Then cholestyramine, it was in phase 2 trial but had doubtful results. Then cycloinositol phase 2 trial, but it had also doubtful results. Then selective A beta 42 lowering agents or beta secretase inhibitors and non-peptidic inhibitors, which were tried in animal models. Then immunotherapy, in which there is active immunization, which is a vaccination. The vaccine was AN1792 phase 2 trial, but it had negative results. Then CAD106, ACC101 phase 2 trials. Then GSK 933776 a phase 1 trial, and DNA epitope vaccine antibodies against the beta secretase cleavage site mucosal vaccination, which were trialed in animal models. Then the second group was drugs interfering with the metals, that is PBT2, which was in phase 2 trial but had positive results. Then gamma secretase inhibitor, which is the important aspect of this therapy, which included semaglutide, which was in phase 3 trial but had negative results. Then tarenflubril or flurizan, which was in phase 3 trial but also had negative results. Then avagasistat phase 2 trial. Passive immunization included monoclonal antibodies, that is bapineuzumab, solanezumab, in phase 2 trials but had positive results. Then disease modifying treatments affecting modulation of tau deposition. The drugs interfering with tau deposition was methylene blue or methyl ammonium chloride, which was in phase 2 trial but had promising results. Then drugs interfering with tau phosphorylation, that is tau kinase inhibitors. Lithium, which was there in phase 1 trial in Alzheimer's dementia, but it had negative results. Then immunotherapy, which included vaccination in preclinical trials. We'll see one by one, that is anti-amyloid disease modifying treatments. What they do, they reduce A beta 42 production by beta secretase inhibitors. They reduce A beta plaque burden via aggregation inhibitors. They also promote A beta clearance via active or passive immunotherapy. What are beta secretase inhibitors? They specifically inhibit beta secretase enzyme in the amyloid cascade. Phase 3 trial included bapineuzumab, solanezumab, and verubicistat, but the trials failed. The recent data showed verubicistat, atabicistat, and LY3202626 reported to be associated with detrimental effects on cognition in prodromal Alzheimer's dementia. Then anti-amyloid immunotherapy or vaccines on horizon, that is amyloid vaccines, they reduce plaque burden and memory loss in transgenic mouse model of Alzheimer's dementia. Human vaccination with A beta 42, but the trial failed because 6% patients, they develop meningoencephalitis due to T cell sensitization. Then second generation vaccines remain under development and included ACC001 and CAD106. Then passive A beta immunotherapy, the phase 3 development included adalimumab, gantenerumab, and BANC2401 in prodromal or very mild Alzheimer's dementia. Then crenezumab, gantenerumab, and solanezumab in prevention trials for preclinical or at-risk genetic risk population, it was tried. Then anti-tau inhibitors, that is methyl ammonium chloride or methylene blue, it inhibits tau aggregation. Phase 3 trial conducted for mild to moderate Alzheimer's dementia, but it failed to slow cognitive decline because 30% dropout rate was there due to side effects. The recent update being UB311 synthetic peptide vaccine, which is tested by United Neurosciences using intramuscular injections in a number of human trials. It completed phase 2A trial on 43 patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's dementia followed for 78 weeks. In January 2019, the results showed a positive trend in the treatment for secondary outcomes. There was an extension study also followed for 96 weeks treatment period, then 12 weeks follow-up period. The primary outcomes are safety, tolerability, with the secondary outcomes included changes in cognition, functionality, and biomarkers. The results are expected in March 2021. The concluding slide, while we wait for successful pharmacotherapy, there are these multiple pathways leading to Alzheimer's dementia can be taken advantage to test hypotheses regarding risk reduction and mitigation. There are many efforts to prevent cognitive decline, and the development of dementia may be more successful when it is multimodal. And multimodal approaches, they are more effective than single approaches. They are more directed to at-risk individuals or at the root cause impairment based on their personal health profile rather than using one-size-fits-all approaches. Now, this is the time to abandon generalized approaches to Alzheimer's dementia and consider neurodegenerative disorders as a diseases of lifetime. There should be a personalized medicine approach, which is a way to build a better brain as we age. Therefore, at the end, there are two questions we should have for discussion. That is, how much should a therapeutic agent inhibit amyloid beta production or facilitate amyloid beta clearance? And what stage in the disease process should such a therapeutic agent be administered to produce a disease modifying effect in Alzheimer's dementia? My maximum references are taken from Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease, Lessons Learned and Applied from Journal of American Geriatric Sciences by Galvin et al. Then the second article is Update on Alzheimer's Disease Therapy and Prevention Strategies, taken from Annual Revision Medicine 2017 by Graham et al. And Current and Future Treatment for Alzheimer's Disease by Constantina and Socrates in the Therapeutics and Advances of Neurological Disorders in 2013. Thank you.
Great. I think it was an extensive list of measures which included simple preventive measures like diet and reducing the cardiovascular risk factors, and then mental activity, hobbies, etc., to all the recent advances, anti-amyloid and anti-tau. So there is a big spectrum through which you'll have to go when you write such an answer. Now we are moving on to normal pressure hydrocephalus, which is more of a clinical neurology question. Although there are certain new advances which you will in this area as well, which you will hear from Dr. Shrikant Deshmukh, who is a young neurologist from Aurangabad. Off to Dr. Shrikant, please.
Very good evening to all of you. I first of all thanks Fine Organizing Committee for offering me this opportunity to interact with all of you. My talk today is about normal pressure hydrocephalus. So as you can see, this will be the format of my talk. And I got a very nice slide which just showed the clinical features of NPH, wacky, wobbly, and weight, which generally covers all three important clinical features of NPH. So basically, to start with a little bit about the CSF circulation. So as we know, the CSF is predominantly formed in the choroid plexuses and somewhere in the meninges also. And so the rate of production is around 20 ml per hour. So it comes to 500 ml per day. It goes from lateral ventricles to third ventricle. Then it goes to the foramina of Luschka and Magendie to the subarachnoid spaces over cerebral convexities, spinal canal, and then it gets reabsorbed with arachnoid villi in the form of granulations, and also with the spinal root sleeves when the roots exit from the spinal canal. Normally, this CSF flow is directed by the pulsatile flow in the cerebral arteries, which helps the CSF to move in motion. At any point of time, the amount of CSF present in the circulation is 125 to 150 ml. So as you can see, this process will repeat approximately 4 times in a day, the production. Out of that, 20% will be in the ventricles, 65% will be in the cerebral arachnoid space, and 15% will be in the spinal subarachnoid space. And as you all know, normal pressure is 80 to 180 mm of Hg, and it generally represents the venous pressure, which is transmitted through the venous sinuses. So this NPH terminology was coined by neurologist Adams and the neurosurgeon Solomon Hakims in 1965, generally classified into idiopathic and secondary. Now, when we talk, it is a secondary NPH. That means there are some clinical markers in the form of large head, triventriculomegaly without involvement of 4 ventricles, aqueductal stenosis, no signal change around ventricular system, and the causes will be past cases of meningitis, SAH, compensated congenital hydrocephalus, or trauma. As you can see in this, that there is ventriculomegaly, but there is no ventricular seepage, and as well as there is no dash, you can see here. And in this figure, you can see a small fibrous web in the aqueduct, which is causing aqueductal stenosis. So NPH is also classified in this form, idiopathic and secondary, with dash and non-dash. We'll come to that in our next slides. So as you can see, this is a very busy slide, which generally mentions the pathogenesis, all the factors involved in the pathogenesis of NPH. And as you can see, despite being almost 50 to 60 years from this term is coined, there has been a lack of clarity as far as the origin of NPH is concerned, or the primary trigger of NPH is concerned. And this is a busy slide, but however, I've made it little easy to comprehend. So almost all the studies, they are unanimous in the assumption that the basic trigger is in the venous system. The absorption of the CSF gets hampered due to some problem with the absorption of the CSF in the venous sinuses, and it leads to venous hypertension. Now, whenever there is a venous hypertension, to compensate for that lack of absorption, the CSF initially moves very quickly or through the aqueduct, and which may give rise to prominent flow void in the initial part of the disease process. Then as the intracranial compliance gets less and less, maybe due to the stiffening of the arteries, this movement of the CSF across the aqueduct also gets reduced, and then it will give rise to loss of flow void, which is generally seen in the advanced cases of NPH. And as the things evolve, it will cause increased systolic pressure and water hammer effect, which I'll explain in the next slide. So basically the force exerted on the ventricles is a centrifugal force away from the ventricles towards the brain parenchyma. And this transmittal pressure gradient from the ventricles to the subarachnoid space. So in fact, NPH is kind of a misnomer, because in all the studies, we have found that there have been in ICP monitoring, the B waves are prominently seen when you measure the CSF in a prolonged monitoring. So when this transmittal pressure increases, obviously there is a reduction in the cerebral perfusion pressure. And obviously this reduction is responsible for many of the neurological deficits which we encounter in the NPH. As we know, the normal ventricular surface is around 60 centimeter. And when the ventricles gets dilated, it becomes almost doubled, 120. So as the Pascal's law, force is equal to pressure into area. So the normal pressure is 150, but the area is doubled. So the force exerted on the ventricles is around 300, so double than the normal. So you can see the impact of this pressure on the ventricles. Now, this is actually what is water hammer. I mean, this is a wall which is open, and the water is flowing across the wall. But by any reason, this wall is suddenly closed. The water stream gets, it becomes chaotic. And as you can see, it can cause this water hammer effect on the walls of the pipe. So this is actually what happens when the aqueductal flow gets hampered. The CSF causes more damage onto the ventricular walls, and it gets progressively dilated. So it's kind of a hydraulic shock due to sudden obstruction of the CSF flow. Now this water hammer pulse is also implicated in the pathogenesis of syringomyelia as well as in empty sella syndrome. Now coming to the clinical features, the impairment of periventricular frontal cortical basal ganglia or thalamocortical circuit is the primary culprit which is involved in the clinical manifestations. And as we know, gait impairment is the most common clinical feature, which is seen in close to 94 to 100% of patients. Also known with these different names, characterized by small steps, wider base, reduced foot clearance, difficulty turning, postural instability, grasp reflex in the foot. However, there is no Babinski sign, and basically it's a higher level gait disorder. When the disease advances, it will lead to hydrocephalic asthesia abasia, meaning that the patient will have significant difficulty even while getting up from the sitting position or getting from the lying down position. It's a severe kind of apraxia. And when we differentiate this from Parkinson's, obviously what in this way it differs from the Parkinson's in that it has a wider base, it has increased foot angle, upper limbs are normal, and generally fascination is not observed in NPH. Although sometimes you may confuse with the Parkinson of an NPH. Second symptom is cognitive impairment, which is seen in close to 78 to 98% of patients. Now, it is basically a frontal subcortical kind of dementia, which has psychomotor slowing, reduced attention, reduced concentration, impaired executive function, apathy are the prominent symptoms. And along with that, depression is also very common. So as you can see, it is quite different from the Alzheimer's clinical spectrum, which is more of the cortical problems. Urinary incontinence is the generally the last symptom which generally comes into the picture. And even in that, urgency is the most common symptom. Incontinence happens in very advanced stages of the NPH. So even the urinary urgency, if patient has, it still fits the diagnostic criteria of NPH. In Bradley, it has been mentioned that some patients of NPH during the earlier stage of ventricular enlargement may experience drop attacks. Now, these are the two prominent guidelines for the diagnosis of NPH. One is an international guideline and other is a Japanese guideline. So as you can see here, this international guideline and Japanese both have Evans index, which is more than 0.3. In international, no obstruction to CSF flow, enlarged temporal horns, not due to atrophy, periventricular ooze and aqueductal flow void. And in this Japanese, callosal angle and DESH, these two are the additions in Japanese guidelines. So as Dr. Nikhil has already mentioned to you regarding MRI features, you can see these prominent sylvian spaces which are filled with the CSF. And because of that, these cerebral convexities become very tight. Because of this pressure of the CSF spaces, these cerebral convexities become very tight. So these two features are very important. And basically this term was coined in 2010. So it's kind of a relatively newer term as far as NPH is concerned. So basically, why DASH is important? Because there are multiple papers which mentions the predictive value of DASH as a shunt responsiveness in idiopathic normal pressure hydrocephalus. So basically it was based on Symphony trial. The positive predictive value for shunt responsiveness is close to 77% and negative predictive value is 25. So most of these patients having DASH will respond better to shunt. However, it is not absolute. Still there are patients who are non-DASH will respond to shunt, but the probability is slightly less. Now Evans index, as we all know, it's basically the frontal horns, maximum width of the frontal horns and the maximum internal width of the skull. If it is more than 0.3, it is pathognomonic. And the reduced callosal angle, generally it is seen in the coronal section at the posterior commissure level in an axis which is perpendicular to anterior commissure, posterior commissure plane. Normally this angle is around 100 to 120 degree, but in NPH, the angle gets progressively reduced and it is around 50 to 80 degrees. Now, what are the diagnostic tests for LPH? Most common is a LP test, lumbar puncture test. In that, around 30 to 50 ml of CSF is removed. The positive predictive value of LP is close to, you can say 100%, but negative predictive value is also 42%. Accuracy is 40%. Now, as we know, this is the CSF rate production. So when you remove around 30 to 50 ml of CSF, naturally within 3 hours, the CSF will get replaced, whatever you have removed. So theoretically speaking, you need to assess this patient within 3 hours of LP. But normally patients are generally assessed within first half an hour after doing an LP test. However, there are some reports in which they have mentioned that the recovery may or the response may be seen after 24 hours. So there is little variability as far as the timing of the reassessment post LP is concerned. Now, these are the parameters which are normally videotaped before doing LP, and then they are assessed after doing LP, which is time to walk 10 meters, turn 180 degree and return to starting point. Number of steps needed to turn 180 degree twice, and number of steps needed to turn 360 degree 3 times, and having an average of that. So improvement in any one of these parameters is considered positive. Now, second is external lumbar drainage. It is generally an invasive procedure in which around 10 ml per hour of CSF is drained for consecutive 3 to 5 days. This is generally done only in cases where there is a strong clinical suspicion with negative LP test. However, one has to bear with this potential complication of meningitis. So not being done practically in most of the centers. Then non-invasive FDG PET. Caudate hypometabolism is considered a pathognomonic feature as far as the PET scan is concerned in NPH. Along with that, normal cortical metabolism is essential if you are dealing with a proper NPH case without any added neurodegenerative disorder. Then CSF biomarkers, low amyloid and low tau are commonly observed in the CSF of NPH patients, basically due to impaired drainage of metabolic products. And these two, MR cysternography, in which you infuse a dye, which normally should get washed out within 72 hours. But in NPH, this dye stays in the ventricle for close to 72 hours. And the second is a CSF infusion study, in which you infuse a normal saline, and in which if there is a resistance to that, it is again a diagnostic of for NPH. Now, coming to the treatment of NPH, as we all know, VP shunt or lumboperitoneal shunt are the commonly used modalities. It's a level C evidence as far as AN guidelines are concerned. Now, this is very interesting. After the diagnosis of NPH, if there is a 3-month delay for going on for the shunting, then the improvement may be very less, 5%, as compared to the 65% in immediately shunted cases. So it is a point to be really taken into consideration when we are dealing with NPH cases. Now, valves, as we know, are 2 types. One is a fixed pressure valve, low, medium, and high. And most of the neurosurgeons generally put a medium pressure valve. And then now the newer ones are the adjustable valves, which require less, there is a less need for revision or intervention. So when opening valve pressure is set to a lower level than the opening pressure, the over drainage of CSF can occur, and it can cause SDH, hygroma, or slit ventricular system. So this valve pressure needs to be set very meticulously and properly. So good response is generally seen in patients in whom gait impairment occurs before cognitive impairment, if there is no dementia, if it's a secondary NPH due to some causative factor, and if there is a dash and tight cerebral convexity. And poor response is seen in those patients who have vascular risk factors, alcohol abuse, sleep apnea. Because of that, possibly they mentioned that the CSF dynamics change, and heart failure, which also contributes to impaired CSF dynamics. In this, I would like to add loss of flow void as one of the parameter, which will generally have a poor response to shunting. These are the programmable valves, Hakim-Codman valves, and as we know, these are the magnets with which we can externally program the valve pressures from outside. There is no need for any invasive therapy. There was one good paper in Japan where they have surveyed close to 2,500 cases of NPH. It's a retrospective study, and in which what they have found is that the associated comorbidities in the form of Alzheimer's disease and the cervical spondylotic myelopathies, these are the only 2 conditions which may significantly impair in the overall outcome of the patients who are shunted. So basically, if patient has these 2 entities, one need to be very careful before proceeding for the shunting, taking into consideration what are the risks and what are the benefits involved in the shunting. So as we can see in this paper, as the decades have passed by, the complications have reduced and the improvements have steadily increased, maybe because of the techniques involved and the more and more advances in the the pathophysiology of the NPH, the improvement rates are significantly high. And even at the age, at 3 years, the improvement stays up to 73%. This improvement after shunting is normally evaluated with either MRS scale or NPH scale. The NPH scale has 4 parameters: gait, cognition, balance, and urinary symptoms. It has 0 to 100 numbering, and these scales are given in the continuum, so you can refer to that if you wish. So we have talked about the surgical part of it, but as we can see, there are some papers which have mentioned that repetitive lumbar puncture as a treatment for NPH. What these 2 papers have shown that there are some patients who are non-surgical candidates who are not fit for surgery. In those patients, you can try this trial of acetazolamide as well as repetitive lumbar punctures. In those, some patients are good responders and some are non-responders. So those patients who are good responders, you may continue this kind of therapy for some period of time till the time it gives benefit, and then you can stop once you feel it is not improving. But it still has got some role. And coming to this last slide, as we know, the NPH, the age of onset is around 75 years. So at this age group, we obviously expect more patients to have associated Alzheimer's-like pathology as a normal variation. So this was one paper which has assessed this associated Alzheimer's-like pathology in the patients who were shunted and the cortical brain biopsies were taken. In that, what they found is close to 20 to 50% of cases will show changes suggestive of Alzheimer's disease. So which is quite normal considering the Braak staging, in which we know that 33% of the patients above 75 years will have some changes which are suggestive of Alzheimer's disease. However, the problem with the studies is that the site of biopsy. Now, when you do a shunt, the biopsy is normally taken from a parietal cortex. And as we know, the Alzheimer's pathology starts in the entorhinal cortex. So this area is never biopsied. So patient may still have Alzheimer's, which is not, the changes have not come into the parietal lobe. So you may miss the early cases. Timing of the biopsy, obviously, there will be some maybe patients who have Alzheimer's in the initial phase, which may proceed and cause full-blown Alzheimer's in the later part. So in these patients, initial improvement in gait and urinary symptoms may occur, but eventually they will have more and more cognitive impairment. So all the cases needs individualized assessment. And what I have gathered from this analysis is doing a FDG or amyloid PET scan in all patients who are undergoing Alzheimer's, and making sure that they are not having moderate to severe changes of Alzheimer's is key before proceeding for the shunting. So this was my last slide, and these are my references as you can see here. So any questions I'll be happy to take at the end of this session. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very nice. Dr. Deshmukh has covered everything. Remember, we need to elaborate on the usefulness of clinical features, MRI, and those parameters that were discussed, the concept of DESH, usefulness and sensitivity, specificity of LP, how to monitor the scales. We may not by heart, but at least if we mention them, we may score an added point.
Yeah.
So I think he has covered everything, and when you receive the PDFs, you should be able to make use of them. Let's move on to our last lecture now, which is more in the clinical neurology area of the papers, and that is on reversible dementias, which I will be talking on. And I think Dr. Deshmukh, if you let me share your screen, share my screen. Okay. Yeah. So this goes more in the clinical neurology, as I just said, and I will cover these points which you are going to receive in the PDF. And this is how, if you introduce the lecture, the write-up, then you will remember for yourself what you are going to cover. So the first slide includes the definition, although unlike many disorders where definitions are crystallized, here it is not done so by the standard organizations. And an author has suggested a practical definition saying that it involves conditions in which cognitive and/or behavioral features are present, and specific treatment may lead to partial or full reversal. Now, why is there a need to look for treatable or reversible dementia? Basically, there are two categories. Treatable cause of cognitive impairment, that means completely reversible, and also we need to search for reversible or modified comorbidities in primary degenerative. We may not result in complete resolution, but we may still be able to delay the time to dependence. And so why is it important? Because early recognition of progressive degenerative dementia gives patient and family the opportunities to, clarify end-of-life plans and enables the family to plan for financial aspects. So if we come to know that it's a relentlessly progressive condition, then the approach of the patient and family may differ from otherwise if you disclose diagnosis of a reversible condition. Here is this slide from an important article. So you identify by thorough interview both of the patient as well as a caregiver, and physical examination, which should include a full neurological examination. Obviously, many of them will have some focal signs or long tract signs, assessment of cognitive function, obviously, and behavioral symptoms and activities of daily life, for which you may need help of neuropsychologist and a psychiatrist, and laboratory tests, which I am going to cover in detail in my future slides. Here, epidemiology wise, the reported frequency has been 0 to 23%, which has been endorsed by a study in India as well. And coming to causes, most frequent, I have formed a mnemonic here for your easy remembrance. Under D comes drug depression, which is the most important and commonest, and drug adverse effects. And in endocrine, we have the thyroid and parathyroid and the hypo and hyperglycemia. And under M, we have chronic meningitis and certain miscellaneous condition. SIH has been mentioned by the recent review by Continuum. Under E comes obviously the metabolic, hepatic, uremic, and hypoxic and hypercarbic encephalopathies, as well as the popular encephalitides, which I am going to have a slide on. And under N, you've already just heard normal pressure hydrocephalus, and the nutritional disorders cannot be missed. Tumors and toxins, we all know. And under I have covered infections and inflammatory diseases. And then obviously you cannot complete this write-up answer without alcohol abuse and subdural hematomas. And remember, metabolic encephalopathies, the chronic ones, will also overlap with a delirium. So they will fluctuate between dementia, sort of their presentation as chronic cognitive declines, and they may have surges of delirium in between. As against progressive dementias, what are the ones that don't come under our domain? Are obviously, we all know the primary degenerative and the first three of them, which you've heard a lot about in our previous lectures, as well as dementias in the setting of Parkinsonism. A lot of it cannot be reversed, and cognitive impairments in other diseases such as Huntington's, spinocerebellar ataxias, and spastic paraplegias. And even some of the non-degenerative such as vascular, hypoxic ischemic, traumatic, and prion diseases are irreversible as well. So here I have prepared this slide which is a jinx of the recent continuum 2019. So strategies to recognize patients with potentially treatable causes are looking for atypical features such as rapid decline in function, which you will come across with nutritional, as well as some fast growing tumors, vasculitis and toxins, and rarely a continuum has presented a case of spontaneous intracranial hypotension. Age, if it is younger than expected at symptom onset, again, the conditions such as vasculitis and autoimmune encephalitis. Prominent fluctuations will again be seen with toxic metabolic encephalopathies, and also with and we should also include obstructive sleep apnea as well as drugs. High risk exposures to agents such as alcohol, toxins and drug abuse. We all know high risk behaviors with the two important etiologies, and unexplained, unanticipated findings are seen with depression, where you may have mismatch between the symptoms vis-a-vis the clinical performance, and then you may see long track signs with tumors and some ocular and cerebellar signs with Wernicke's encephalopathy. And there may be incongruent performance between history and cognitive assessment, again with depression, where there may be a lot of symptoms, but the patient on coaxing may be able to perform quite well. So a little bit on individual pathologies. Depression, we all know, we address it as pseudodementia. We may have past history of major depression, and like I said, cognitive dysfunction on testing may be due to decreased effort rather than actually true cognitive impairment. So here are certain differences. In depression, you will have a precise onset, short duration, and symptoms are pretty standard, such as lack of motivation, low mood, alterations in sleep and appetite, poor motivation and things like that. Whereas with dementia, the symptoms will vary depending upon the cause of dementia. And psychiatric history will be common with depression. Affect will be depressed. And there may be more don't know answer with depression, whereas dementia patient will make an effort and will try to concentrate, but may not be able to perform well. Other atypical psychiatric disorders such as personality, conversion and psychosis also may show many features which may look like true dementia. But also remember that psychiatric features are an early symptom of many neurodegenerative conditions such as frontotemporal, the Parkinson plus syndromes, Lewy body dementia, as well as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Under drugs, we know hypnotics, opiates, antihistaminics, antihypertensives such as beta blockers. We all know the antipsychotics, antidepressants, mood stabilizing agents, and anticonvulsants, mainly phenobarbital, sodium valproate, topiramate, and zonisamide. And we all know the notorious anticholinergics and metronidazole and cefixime, which cause encephalopathy. I'm sure you have heard a case here and there, and muscle relaxants and immunosuppressive agents like tacrolimus and cyclosporine. Remember, steroids themselves will cause marked distraction. So under endocrine, we all know commonly the hypothyroidism as well as the hyper and hyperparathyroidism. And under encephalopathies, don't forget to mention dialysis dementia syndrome and its relation with aluminium, and that we need reducing dialysate aluminium may cause some improvement. And chronic respiratory failures, including condition obstructive sleep apnea and rarely Wilson's disease, in addition to actually not rarely, fairly commonly Wilson's, in addition to the movement disorders, will also have cognitive impairment. And in encephalitis, the viruses, mainly the limbic ones, HSV, we all know early acyclovir reduces chance of cognitive morbidity, and Autoimmune limbic encephalitis such as AMPA, NMDA, and GABA, if detected and treated early, can be fairly well reversed. Under paraneoplastic encephalomyelitis, which is seen with small cell lung cancer, and limbic encephalitis, paraneoplastic, again with SCLC, teratomas, and lymphomas. And we all know the reversible encephalopathy with thyroiditis, previously called Hashimoto's, also comes under this domain. We should write pellagra, which is, we should mention points such as under-recognized, as incidence has dramatically decreased due to food fortification in the West, and all 3Ds may not be present and often coexist with alcoholic delirium and Wernicke's, and that the clinical features are quite heterogeneous, including both psychiatric as well as cognitive presentations, and patients will have both motor signs as well as cognitive impairment. And under B12, in addition to the standard subacute combined degeneration, it is now a well-established fact that encephalopathy can be a presentation, and that the symmetrical white matter hyperintensities may be seen on MRI, which go away after treatment. And folate does cause cognitive impairment, and it may contribute to cognitive impairment of the normally aging brain, as well as it has a role as as folate deficiency increases the risk of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. So tumors in strategic locations such as olfactory groove and parasagittal in the frontal lobes, which deliver executive functions, as well as butterfly gliomas and multifocal metastasis. Here, headache may be mild if the tumors are very slow growing, and look for papilledema and focal signs. You have to mention that. And the pattern of cognitive dysfunction will not be classically fitting into any of the primary degenerative dementias. Under toxins, remember to mention industrial exposures, and it starts acutely and then carries on, they carry on as florid encephalopathies, and may progress over hours to days, unlike rapidly progressive dementias which progress over weeks to months. And GI symptoms are associated in most except thallium. And we all know lead encephalopathy is common in children, whereas neuropathy is common in adults. And look for anemia and lead lines. Likewise, in arsenic, look for renal failure, and in mercury, tremor as well as desquamation. And although it has become rare, mention manganese toxicity in minors, and it is associated with significant Parkinsonism. And we all are aware that organophosphorus poisoning can cause delayed cognitive disturbances, and if treated early, then we can prevent some of the delayed manifestations of organophosphorus poisoning. Under infections, we have to mention HAD typically occurs in the later stages. It has diminished since introduction of HAD. And remember to mention escape syndrome. It is common with atazanavir and tenofovir, the antiretrovirals with poor CNS penetration. And we should also mention a point that there is a need to differentiate PML from this particular entity HAD. Neurosyphilis has become rare, but still seen in endemic areas and areas where there is homosexual exposures and multiple sexual partners. And cognitive dysfunction is a late but a common neurological manifestation, and its manifestations have now become atypical or mild since the antibiotic era. Mention these points at least. And then you should also write about a little bit about Whipple's disease. We all know the etiological agent, and that it has malabsorption syndrome with abdominal features and lymphadenopathy. And neurological involvement, although rare, but may occur in absence of GI symptoms. And dementia is the commonest, followed by ataxia, seizures, supranuclear ophthalmoplegia. As you know, it is a differential of PSP, and our characteristic movement disorder in the form of oculomasticatory myarrhythmia. And diagnosis can be held by small intestinal biopsy. Alcohol, very important. Alcohol itself, does it really contribute to dementia? Yes. Complete abstention and consuming more than 14 drinks increases the chance of dementia. Around less than 1 drink per day, less than 6 drinks per week. Some trials have shown have beneficial effect, but that doesn't mean it is recommended. In addition to more than 14 drinks, binge drinking has found to be detrimental. And under nutritional, mention Wernicke's encephalopathy. Although it's an encephalopathy, it will have its own cognitive features, and mention Korsakoff's. Remember, we need to prevent Korsakoff's from occurring by treating Wernicke's as emergency, because amnesia after a certain period may not revert, and Korsakoff's occurs because of repeated bouts of inadequately treated acute encephalopathy. And amnestic disorder has both antero as well as retrograde amnesia, and we all know about confabulation. I just mentioned pellagra, and remember to write few lines on Marcia fava bignami, which is selective corpus callosal demyelination, comes as an acutely confusional state or dementing syndrome with its classic neurological features, and pathogenesis slightly less understood. Miscellaneous etiologies write chronic meningitis like tuberculosis and fungal, and the mechanisms in the form of cognitive impairment in the form of vascular infarcts, granulomas, hydrocephalus, and raised intracranial pressure. And in the Indian scenario, mention neurocysticercosis, and then also mention CNS vasculitis. And as I said earlier, in 2019 continuum, they emphasize spontaneous intracranial hypotension as well. So the purpose of our investigations are to look for all of these etiologies, and the ones I have highlighted in bold are the ones that you have to do, which includes MRI brain, and then you have to select some of the tests of all this exhaustive lists that I have put across, depending upon the clinical features that you come across, which will include testing for syphilis, then connective tissue and collagen, connective tissue and vasculitis, thyroid antibodies, autoimmune and paraneoplastic antibodies, antibodies for gluten, copper studies, and under CSF, we have to do the CSF for drainage trial, as you learned from Dr. Deshmukh, and viral and bacterial studies need to be done in clinical situations that you find relevant, as well as the Whipple PCR. And occasionally you may need to do CSF cytology and flow cytometry if you're suspecting malignancy, and urine comes handy for heavy metal and copper, and then EEG if you're suspecting CJD, and then PET scan and an angiogram if you're suspecting malignancy and vasculitis respectively. American Academy and Canadian consensus recommend screening for depression, compulsorily recommend screening for depression, structural neuroimaging, B12, thyroid, HIV, and in today's era, they don't consider screening for syphilis compulsory, but is recommended in endemic areas and where homosexuality and multiple sexual partners are is an issue. And further workup, as I mentioned, to be extended as per clinical features and relevance. Under treatment, it's a very exhaustive, it's going to be very exhaustive for you, but make sure that you mention depression, stopping exposure to drugs, toxins, and mention the nutritional supplementation, and in chronic metabolic encephalopathies, occlusion of portosystemic shunt, renal replacement, transplant, thyroid correction, and tumors. And make sure you mention all the antimicrobials and treatment of hydrocephalus. Just make a mention, you don't have to write in detail, because as you can know, NPH itself can become a big answer. And make sure that you mention immunotherapies and special diet with celiacs, and make sure that you say that for paraneoplastic you have to treat the primary cancer, and that there are case reports on immunotherapy, but the response is variable. So I think you try to, make a passing remark to everything rather than writing everything in detail, because otherwise you may not find enough time. And as I said earlier, my references include the continuum and a couple more references which discuss reversible dementias very well. Thank you very much. I hope I have tried to cover most of the conditions that you will have to bring into this answer of reversible dementias. Thank you very much. And before we are open to questions. Before questions, I think I will just again highlight this slide, which will remind you of our Thursday session of neurology clinics, this time by none other than Dr. Khadilkar on a muscle case. Make sure you be present and take advantage of our session. And now I open this session for question and answers. And here is a question, I think, on lumbar drainage. Why is it not useful in IIH? I think Dr. Deshmukh will have to answer this. Why is it not useful in IIH and like this thing? Well, I don't know. Probably it is useful, isn't it?
IIH it is useful. I mean,
It is useful, yeah.
useful. I mean,
There are studies where even lumbar drainage is done for IIH,
for IIH.
but yes, it is useful really.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next question. If we get Alzheimer's disease pathology on FDG
Yeah.
in NPH, is shunting contraindicated? I think again, Dr. Deshmukh.
Yeah, basically it depends on the staging of the Alzheimer's. I mean, if it is in the early stages of Alzheimer's, you can still go ahead, because eventually the patient will take 5 to 7 years to have a cognitive symptoms which are profound. So till that time, at least you can prevent the falls, you can improve his gait, and you can improve his functional capacities. So in that, with proper discussion with the relatives, we can still go ahead if the PET is not showing a very alarming changes of Alzheimer's disease. So we can go ahead.
Absolutely. And I think in one of the slides that you showed, there may be mixed pathologies in
Yeah.
people above 75,
Yeah.
where you have a combination, and if the MRI satisfies the criteria and the clinical,
PH. Yeah.
relevant clinical features are there
Yeah.
in the form of the triad, I think just this thing, what was that? The FDG itself is not dangerous from this thing. Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Another question by Prakash: role of timed up and go test in normal pressure hydrocephalus. Timed up and go.
Yeah, basically, as there is a variability as far as the timing of testing is concerned. But as we see theoretically, the CSF should get replaced in 3 hours. So it should be ideally assessed before 3 hours. Normally books mention it's 30 minutes, but again, it's variable. I mean, I don't have any specific answer that why is to that, because some studies have shown improvement up to 24 hours post tapping. So it's kind of variable, but you can go with the common convention of assessing after 30 minutes post LP actually. And all those 3 parameters which I had mentioned, if there is any one of that shows improvement, you can consider the test as positive. So
So a low sensitivity for that.
yeah.
I think we've covered the questions. My other speakers, if you all want to say something to the students, it's open. Dr. Yevle and Dr. Kadam. Nikhil, you need to unmute.
So regarding time up and go test,
Yeah.
Shrikant sir, I think the time up and go test measures the time required to walk 25 steps.
Yeah.
It is that test.
Yeah, it is
We
that.
commonly do it and or JJ
Yeah.
commonly do this test.
Yeah. So you do after what time? I mean, after LP?
After LP, within 15 minutes,
Yeah,
we
within 15 30 minutes. Yeah.
15-30 minutes, we usually
Yes.
do it.
Yes. Actually, in the recent continuum, they are given 3 different parameters. They are not mentioned this test. So maybe it's an evolving thing. Yeah.
Yes, actually the parameters that you would monitor, there has been a evolution, as you right. Yes, absolutely. And now they are trying the slide that Dr. Deshmukh showed. it may not be possible for your students to mug up those scales,
Yeah.
but make sure that you mention those scales in the answer and the concept behind those scales, why they have been devised, what is their application. It makes the examination more and more objective rather than, you know, just broad, making it broad or subjective. And that purpose, if you write, it should be sufficient. That the examiner should will understand that you understood the concept, why those scales are there. Yes, I think Dr. Yevle, you want to add something? Your mic is also unmuted. Mute, Dr. Yevle. So, you want to add something?
No, nothing from my side.
Okay, good. Thank you. I think, remember, this session has all four theory papers covered under it. You may have the anatomical pathway, the clinical manifestations such as NPH and Alzheimer's. You may have the radiology applied, and obviously you are going to have the recent advances. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, speaker,
Thank you.
for
Thank you. Thank you.
spending time with our students. Thank you.
Good
very
night.
much.